Chapter 1. The Boast in the Arena of Dust. The arena was carved into the red rock of Virox. 7. An ancient world that knew no oceans, only memory etched into stone and the bones of the warriors who trained there. The twin suns loomed overhead like judgmental eyes, casting blistering light onto a field where sweat, sand, and blood mixed daily. Stone pillars encircled the combat ring like fossilized giants, cracked and beaten by 1,000 years of weapons clashing against flesh and fate. Around the perimeter, alien trainees from over a dozen species stood rigid in neat rows, some with tusks, others with glowing limbs or faces wrapped in respirators, all silent under the gaze of the High Trainer, a towering Sikari female with silver scales and a whip coiled at her hip. Her presence was like gravity, heavy, commanding, final. Today was evaluation day, when trainees would be selected or dismissed, elevated or exiled, depending on how they performed and what lineage they dared to claim. And it was today, in this sanctified place, that a skinny, soot-streaked human boy broke the silence with a boast that sent ripples through the dust. Riven Kale stepped forward, his shoulders hunched, but his voice unwavering. "My grandfather trained the men who now stand at the right hand of the Emperor," he said, his accent clearly Terran, his posture not that of a warrior, but a technician. There were no calluses on his knuckles from punching, but rather burns and grease stains from wiring and engine repair. His clothes were ragged, repurposed from a mechanic's coveralls, with a name tag partially torn, reading only K- and a worn patch of Earth's defunct Galactic Trade Corps. A hush fell over the arena, not out of respect, but disbelief. No one had heard such arrogance spoken with such innocence in generations. A Dargothi instructor leaned forward, his antennae twitching with interest. The Azorth twins from the Frost Moons muttered in their hive speak. The tension spread like heat, until it reached the feet of High Trainer Sixilla herself. She descended from her stone platform with the grace of a serpent coiling to strike, her silver-scaled feet crunching softly against the powdery ground. Her eyes narrowed to yellow slits, and her long tail flicked once with irritation. "Speak again, fleshling," she hissed in Galactic Standard, her voice low but resonant, the kind of voice that made trainees flinch even when it whispered praise. "You claim your blood trained those who serve the Imperial Circle?" Riven, swallowing hard but refusing to step back, nodded. "Yes. My grandfather's name was Daneth Kale. He trained the elite of the old Empire's 9th Legion. His knowledge was passed to me through stories, through the craft of movement, and through memory." There was a moment of absolute silence, followed by a sound that cut deeper than any blade. A sharp, flat crack, Sixilla's hand striking the boy's cheek. The force hurled Riven to the ground, where he landed hard on his side, a fresh welt blooming across his face. He didn't cry out. The crowd didn't cheer. It was simply the expected result of insolence. The 9th Legion was forged on Zeven, Sixilla growled, towering over him. "No Terran trained them. You defile history with your lies. And worse, you waste my time." Her tail whipped dangerously, barely missing his face as she turned away. "Remove him," she ordered coldly, gesturing to a pair of brutish enforcers in bone-plated armor. But Riven didn't rise, nor did he retreat. He lay there for a moment, dazed, until a low rumble beneath the arena made the ground quiver slightly. Many assumed it was a distant sand tremor, common in Virox's volcanic crust, but others, those with sensitive hearing or cybernetic sensors, caught something odd. A harmonic vibration, mechanical in nature, approaching from beneath. Before anyone could investigate, a loud grinding noise erupted from the northern entrance of the arena, a colossal rusted gate trembling on ancient hinges. The crowd turned. No one expected a spectacle on evaluation day. And yet, from the shadow of that opening, a figure emerged that hadn't walked these grounds in decades. He was a man of medium height, but somehow seemed taller than the behemoths that flanked him. Dressed in simple mechanic's garb, patchy armor bolted over worn fabric, his boots coated in the red sands of Virox, he moved with a gait that held no fear of alien judgment. His hands were calloused, his hair peppered with gray, and at his belt hung a series of tools that seemed more like surgical instruments than devices of war. But it was his eyes that silenced the arena. Blue, clear, and defiant. Eyes that had seen through smoke and darkness. Eyes that had watched friends die and machines come alive again under his care. Eyes that some, in whispered circles, claimed were once trained by the Empire's deadliest units. "Get up, boy," the man said softly, his voice gravel and fire. Riven stirred, blinking in confusion. "Grandfather?" "No," the man replied with the faintest smirk. "I'm just the mechanic who kept his blade sharp. And you've got a lot to learn before you wear that name." Scylla took one step forward, fury rising in her composure. "You have no right to be here. Who are you to interfere with Dash? I'm the one who kept your damn arena's power systems from collapsing 2 winters ago." The mechanic cut in, brushing dust off a control panel embedded in the outer wall, as if he still owned it. "I'm the one who calibrated the gravity dampeners when your elite trainees were vomiting like drunkards on Zero-G Day. And I'm the one who made sure the Emperor's favored warriors didn't die in orbit when the reentry shields failed because your guild forgot to check coolant valves." He looked up, locking eyes with her. "So you'll forgive me if I feel entitled to watch how you treat my student." There was no applause, no outburst, just stunned silence. Because despite the arrogance of the words, there was weight in them. Half the devices in the arena bore his mark. Half the trainers had weapons he had repaired. The weapons of war functioned because of hands like his, and those who knew the old days, those rare few still breathing, remembered a name whispered in reverent tones by warriors, mechanics, and soldiers alike. Thale Morin, the ghost mechanic of the 9th Legion. The High Trainer's eyes narrowed. "If this boy truly bears your teaching, then prove it. Let him fight. Let us see if his blood holds truth or only noise." Thale turned to Riven, crouched beside him, and offered a hand. "Well," he murmured, "you made a mess, didn't you?" Riven, eyes wide, nodded and took the hand. Thale pulled him to his feet. "Then let's clean it up," he whispered, brushing the dust from the boy's shoulders. "You're not ready, but you're about to show them what ready looks like." The crowd began to stir. Aliens repositioned, some activating recording implants, others whispering to one another in dialects forbidden outside war zones. The ring was cleared, and a training bot was summoned, a towering golem laced with anti-human protocols, faster and deadlier than any untrained combatant could handle. Riven's jaw clenched. "You're kidding," he muttered. Thale didn't laugh. He simply pressed a device into the boy's palm. A small orb of glowing circuitry, no bigger than a coin, clicked softly. "Your grandfather didn't just teach warriors. He built them." The orb expanded, wrapping itself around Riven's wrist like liquid steel, hardening into a bracer with glowing lines of old Empire tech. "Now remember what I said. Don't aim to win. Aim to teach them they were wrong." As the training golem activated, steam hissing from its joints, and Riven stepped into the ring with one hand still trembling. No one knew that today's boast would be the first line in a new legend, one not written in stone, but in circuits, scars, and the grit of a human heart surrounded by alien eyes waiting for him to fall. But Riven Kale wasn't just anyone. He was a boy with fire in his blood, a ghost's legacy on his shoulders, and a mechanic's whisper in his ear. And the arena was about to learn again that you never underestimate the ones who fix what others break. The moment the training golem surged forward, its metallic limbs groaning with centuries-old vengeance, the boy's instincts screamed to flee, but something deeper, some ember of ancient pride ignited within him, anchoring his feet in the dirt as the crowd leaned in with barely hidden anticipation of his humiliation. Sparks flared from the construct's knees as it lunged, its arms sweeping in a wide arc meant to break bone rather than simulate combat. And yet Riven didn't retreat. Not fully. His body shifted just far enough for the strike to miss, his boots skimming across the sand as the metallic fist buried itself into the earth beside him, spraying gravel and heat. The observers chuckled cruelly, expecting him to trip or panic, but instead he pivoted and pressed the bracer on his wrist, feeling its humming heat spread into his nerves like a second pulse. The device lit up with blue sigils, rotating in complex patterns, awakening old code buried deep in the Empire's databanks. And as it did, the golem paused, hesitating for just half a breath, as if it recognized something ancient and dangerous in the pulse of the boy's signal. The pause was short-lived, but it was enough. Thale Morin watched with arms folded from the edge of the ring, his expression unreadable but his silence deafening. While the boy ducked another blow, his body now moving with the awkward grace of someone whose limbs were learning choreography written long before he was born. The bracer fed his muscles hints, traces, impressions of counters, patterns, not quite thoughts, but memories stitched into reaction. It wasn't fighting. It was remembering. Riven grunted as he twisted beneath a sweep kick that could have torn his legs apart and came up beneath the golem's exposed servo joint, slamming his forearm into the narrow gap, just as the bracer emitted a high-pitched tone. The strike wasn't strong but precise, and that was enough. The golem stuttered, recalibrated, stepped back to reassess. Around the arena, murmurs began. Trainees who had dismissed the boy as nothing more than sand under their feet now leaned forward, wondering how this untrained human had disabled a limb of a device meant to challenge elite combatants. But the golem was not programmed to show mercy, nor was it fooled by coincidence. Its eyes flared red, and suddenly the training session shifted into phase 2, where the goal was not evaluation, but elimination. Scylla, watching from her platform, did not stop it. If anything, her eyes brightened with cold interest, curious if the boy's corpse would twitch after the golem was done with it. Phil said nothing. He hadn't brought Riven here to be coddled. He had brought him here because if the Empire were to remember the Kale name, it had to be earned under fire and fear. Riven felt the change before it happened. The machine no longer attacked with rhythm. It moved like something alive, unpredictable, vicious, its artificial intelligence adapting. The bracer gave fewer hints now, as if testing his ability to improvise. The next blow came fast, a feint to the left, and a hammering downward elbow aimed at his collarbone. Riven moved sluggishly, narrowly, his boot catching a rock as he rolled, shoulder crashing into the dirt hard enough to draw blood from his cheek as he groaned. But he got up. Not gracefully, not impressively, but defiantly. His face was bruised, his lips split, but he rose anyway, eyes wild not with rage but belief. "Come on," he muttered to the machine. "Let's see if my grandfather really taught ghosts to dance." With that, he sprang forward, not waiting to be attacked, but choosing the moment himself. The golem reacted immediately, throwing a punch that should have decapitated him. Riven slid beneath it, bracing one hand against the construct's thigh and using the momentum to push himself around behind it. With his other hand, he slammed the bracer against a metal port along its spine. The device chirped. For an instant, all power in the golem blinked. Lights dimmed. Motors stalled. The entire arena gasped, but then the golem rebooted instantly, as if shrugging off the interference. Yet the point was made. The boy wasn't just fighting. He was understanding. He wasn't using brute strength. He was using his grandfather's legacy, the mechanic's mind wrapped in a fighter's skin. And it was beginning to scare them. Not just the trainees, not just the instructors. Even Scylla felt the cold twinge of old memory stories she dismissed as myth, of the human who repaired warships with a wrench and led squads without ever picking up a rifle, of the Kale who rebuilt minds broken by war through motion and rhythm. Those stories were nonsense, she had believed. Until today, because now she was watching them live again in the arena's dust, through a trembling boy with fire in his eyes and grease on his fingers, dancing with death, as if he were born to fix what had long been broken. The battle continued. Minutes became a blur of desperation and instinct. The golem began to degrade. Not in hardware but in efficiency. Its calculations became slower, its tracking algorithms distorted. Riven was exploiting its patterns, not through programming, but through perception. He remembered the diagrams etched into his grandfather's wall. He remembered how certain rhythms could trick predictive combat AI. He mimicked the ancient warrior forms not with perfection, but with distortion, deliberately introducing lag and erratic motion, so the golem overcompensated, overreached, and missed. By the time the fight was forced to end by Thale himself stepping forward and raising a magnetic disruptor that shut down the machine, the crowd had changed. Where there had been mockery, now there was silence. Where there had been superiority, now there was something foreign to these alien warriors: respect. Scylla stood still. Her whip did not twitch. She descended once more into the arena, stepping toward the boy who now knelt in the dust, breath heaving, arms scraped and bruised but unbowed. She looked down at him, and the crowd held its collective breath. Would she strike again? Would she deny what they had all just seen? But the high trainer did something unexpected. She turned to Thale. "You taught him." Thale shook his head. He taught himself. I just made sure he didn't give up. Sixilla's gaze returned to Riven. You still have much to prove, Caleblood. But this was not noise. And then, in a rare gesture known to be given only twice in her entire career, she pressed her hand to her chest and gave the human boy a curt nod, a warrior's respect. Riven looked up, dazed and covered in sweat and grime, and managed to smile, though it was crooked with pain. So, did I pass? Thale chuckled, walking forward and clapping a hand on the boy's shoulder. You didn't pass, he said. You started. There's a galaxy full of people who think humans are just soft-spine mechanics. You've just given them a reason to worry. The crowd began to disperse slowly, and among them, conversation sparked not just about the fight, but about what it meant. The Kale name was spoken again, not with contempt, but with curiosity, and the whispers of empire, that old, buried fire, began to stir in the cracks of civilization's edges. A ghost had appeared in the dust, and it had a student. Chapter 2, The Name Buried in Steel. The hangars of Virox 7 hummed with a restlessness that had little to do with the shifting atmospheric pressures or the distant tremors that rolled across its cracked desert plains. Instead, it was the air of tension that built when something ancient began to uncoil from sleep, when old truths began to stir beneath the weight of dust and denial. The day after Riven Kale's fight in the arena, the halls of the barracks no longer echoed with mockery at his human origin or snide jests about mechanics playing soldier. Instead, silence met his passing, not cold or hostile, but curious, reverent in a way that made him feel heavier with each step he took. His limbs were sore beyond measure, bandaged in cloth soaked in scent salve, but it wasn't the pain that made his hands tremble as he moved through the corridors beneath the arena. It was the memory of the golem's red eyes bearing down on him, the scrape of steel against his forearm, and the quiet but unrelenting voice of Thale Morin whispering guidance, not like a master, but like a mirror held up to his soul. Thale didn't speak of victory. The mechanic who had once been a myth to the alien legions now moved like a shadow beside Riven, leading him deeper into the bowels of the training compound, past sealed doors and ancient vents that breathed warm, acrid air into the concrete silence. The further they walked, the more Riven noticed the change in architecture. Smooth alloys replaced sandstone. Faint symbols flickered on walls etched with long-dead languages, and each corner held the ghost of some conflict now erased from official history. Finally, they reached a chamber that no recruit had ever been allowed to enter, a vault sealed by rusted glyphs, and a locking mechanism that scanned not code, but presence, as if the door remembered who had once stood before it, and would only open for those it recognized. When Thale pressed his hand to the ancient slab, it clicked softly, gears behind it whispering awake, and the slab split down the middle, retracting with a sigh that sounded almost mournful. Inside, the chamber was dim, illuminated only by vertical light strips buried beneath semi-transparent crystal panels on the floor. The room was wide, circular, lined with metallic racks that held weapons no longer issued, armor no longer forged, and modules of data no longer discussed in the modern academies. At the center of it all was a single console, silent, dormant, but unmistakably imperial, crafted with the brutal elegance of old Earth's highest design. Thale moved toward it without hesitation, tapping a series of runes on its surface, his fingers dancing over long-unused keys like an old pianist returning to his first song. With a shudder, the console powered up, casting a blue light that wrapped the room in eerie illumination, and Riven stepped closer, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat as he saw the symbol glowing on the central display. A circle broken by a vertical blade Kale's crest, lost when the Empire fell into ruin. This is the place your grandfather trained them, Thale said at last, his voice low, brittle with age and memory, and yet steady as steel. Not out in the arena. Not beneath banners and titles. Here where the real warriors were built. Where bones were broken and rebuilt. Where fears were dragged into the light and made into tools. The legionnaires who followed him didn't learn just to fight. They learned to adapt. To think like engineers and move like weapons. That's what made them unstoppable. He stepped aside, gesturing for Riven to approach the console. This room hasn't been accessed in 30 years. Not since Daneth locked it after his last student left for the Emperor's court. I didn't have the right to open it. You do. Riven hesitated, but the bracer on his wrist pulsed once, blue lines flaring softly, as if sensing the proximity to its source. He placed his hand on the panel, and a soft chime responded, unlocking data streams that unraveled across the walls like holographic veins, glowing lines stretching from ceiling to floor, forming simulations, audio logs, kinetic models, even partial DNA profiles of soldiers long gone. He stared in awe as dozens of training sequences appeared around him, phantoms reenacting battles in silence, movements looped in perfect precision, techniques layered not just with muscle memory but tactical philosophy. His grandfather's voice, now warped by time, echoed faintly through the chamber as it narrated movements, explained pressure points, recited mathematical models behind each strike encounter. The recordings were intimate, not meant for mass instruction, but for one-on-one transmission. These were lessons meant for bloodline, for legacy. "This is insane," Riven whispered, tears stinging the corners of his eyes without him realizing. "Why was this hidden?" "Because," Thale replied, crossing his arms and watching the boy carefully. "The Empire feared what it couldn't control. Your grandfather wasn't just training fighters, he was building thinkers, leaders, rebels. They shut it down the moment he died, buried it under bureaucracy, and they never thought a Kale would come back to wake it up." He walked around the room slowly, hands trailing across the walls. "But now you're here, and they'll feel it, out there in the stars." The Kale pulse returning, one heartbeat at a time. Riven stood in the center of the room, absorbing the knowledge around him like a sponge to flame. Each lesson, each visual, each spoken word awakened something in him, not just pride, but clarity. He had been angry his whole life, without knowing why. Always felt misplaced, misunderstood, like a tool kept in the wrong drawer. But here among these projections and memories and echoes he understood. He wasn't just a mechanic's grandson. He was part of a blueprint, a forgotten design for a warrior who could think like a tactician and move like a predator, who could disarm weapons as easily as opponents, and who could bend systems to his will not through hacking, but by understanding their purpose and flow. He was not meant to simply fight battles. He was meant to change them. But knowledge comes with weight, and Thale's eyes darkened as he finally said the words Riven had not expected to hear so soon. "They'll come for you now. You made waves yesterday, not just among the trainees. The Sakari Guild reports to the Tetrarchs, and the Tetrarchs remember your name. They'll either want to use you, or erase you." Riven turned to him, the light of the console casting hard shadows across his face, and for the first time, his voice didn't tremble. "Then we train. Harder than they expect. Faster than they think. We fix what they broke. And we do it our way." Thale nodded slowly, a glint of something old and dangerous returning to his eyes. "Then we start tonight. Outside, the suns of Virox, 7 dipped below the jagged horizon, casting long shadows that made the stone pillars look like the spines of buried giants. And beneath it all, in a chamber sealed by time and blood, a legacy that was thought forgotten flickered to life again, not as prophecy, not as vengeance, but as rebirth. The hours that followed blurred together into a crucible of sweat, bruises, and awakening. The hidden chamber became their sanctum, its walls echoing with grunts, and the low hum of projectors replaying battle patterns older than most galactic treaties. There was no formal structure, no syllabus or routine. Thale trained Riven like he would have repaired a dying war engine, by dismantling his broken parts and reforging him one component at a time. The first lesson wasn't about fists or footwork, it was breathing. Not the automatic kind that drifted without thought, but the kind that matched rhythm with motion, pressure with pace, using every lungful as fuel. Riven had thought he knew what exhaustion was. His time as a mechanic's apprentice on backwater colony ships had taught him how to endure hours bent over broken drives, welding hulls and radiation storms, but what Thale brought was different. This was exhaustion born not from repetition, but from transformation, and each movement he learned rewired his instincts like metal being annealed in fire, reshaped again and again until it could hold under pressure greater than its maker ever intended. By the second night, the simulations shifted from simple motion recalls to multi-enemy scenarios, where Riven's image was dropped into three-dimensional war zones and surrounded by adversaries who were faster, smarter, and infinitely more aggressive. Each loss earned a review, not a punishment, But an audit of his choices, a mechanical breakdown of where instinct faltered and emotion overrode analysis. Fail didn't comfort him after failures. He sharpened them, hammering the pain into discipline, teaching him that losing was a message, not a sentence. Riven bled from real bruises and bled from pride. But somewhere in those hours, his doubt stopped screaming. Somewhere between the 6th and 7th cycle of continuous motion drills, his body found its own gravity, not copying the movements from the ghosts of his grandfather's disciples, but moving with his own weight, his own fire, his own strange and beautiful tempo. Occasionally, Phil would pause the training without warning and ask questions, simple ones with complicated roots. What did you see before he moved? Why did you hesitate when you had initiative? What's the weak point of a Sakari left knee joint under lunar pressure? It was never about how hard Riven could hit, but about what he noticed, what he remembered, what he understood. Phil wasn't crafting a warrior in the traditional sense. He was building a problem solver that happened to wear armor and carry scars. And in that chamber beneath the sand, surrounded by machines older than planets, Riven grew not taller, not broader, but deeper. His movements lost their panic. His choices gained speed. And his silence, once filled with shame, now held patience. But it wasn't just Riven who was changing. Thale Morin, too, seemed to come back to life in the presence of the boy. The mechanic who had once carried entire ships on his back without ever claiming a single medal began to speak more, not just about tactics, but about people. About the way Daneth Kale used to kneel beside broken soldiers and whisper songs from Earth before setting their dislocated joints. About how the 9th Legion learned to repair each other's gear blindfolded, because they believed every warrior should know how to fix what they carried into battle. About how even the Emperor's personal guards used to seek out Daneth not for fighting advice, but for clarity, because he didn't just train muscles, he refined purpose. Thale didn't say it aloud, but Riven felt it in every word. His grandfather hadn't just been a legend, he'd been loved. And that love had shaped the galaxy quietly, irrevocably. It was during one of these sessions that the vault doors trembled, not from pressure, but from proximity. Thale stopped mid-instruction, cocking his head, and his fingers immediately flew over the console, muting the holograms and dimming the lights. Riven, breathless and confused, turned toward the sealed entrance. Footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, measured, unhurried, accompanied by the unmistakable hum of official boots and the static hiss of plasma rifles held on standby. Then came the voice, smooth, aristocratic, and cold as synthetic marble. Thale Morin, you were instructed to vacate Virox 7-5 cycles ago. Unauthorized reactivation of Imperial chambers is a violation under Section 17 of the Preservation Accord. And you're harboring unauthorized personnel. Open this door or face seizure. Thale exhaled slowly and turned to Riven. They're early, he murmured, half to himself. I expected another week. Looks like you made a bigger impact than we thought. Riven stepped forward, his hands clenching unconsciously. What do we do? The mechanic stared at the door for a long moment, then smiled, a weary, wry thing. We don't surrender. But we also don't fight stupidity with fire. Time to show you what real rebellion looks like. He moved to the far wall and pressed his palm against an unmarked panel. It hissed and slid open, revealing a shaft that descended into the darkness beneath the chamber, a tunnel laced with power lines, service ducts, and glowing rails that hadn't been used in decades. Follow me, and don't talk. Riven didn't hesitate. He leapt into the shaft after Thale, the air turning colder as they descended, the light fading behind them. Above, the doors groaned as external override commands tried to force them open. Within minutes, armed officials would flood the room and find nothing but dust, a deactivated console, and echoes of something they couldn't control. They ran through the underlines of Virox 7 for over an hour, passing old engines, decommissioned vehicles, and platforms rusting beneath decades of disuse. Finally, they emerged into an old tram station, long forgotten, its rails bent but functional. Thale booted up a maintenance drone and linked it to a power grid no one had touched since the training compound had been decommissioned. The tram jerked once, then roared to life like a beast waking from an eternal nap. As they climbed aboard, Riven sat beside Thale, both men covered in sweat and grime, their hearts still racing but for different reasons. They're going to keep coming, Riven said. Thale nodded. Let them. The Empire always feared the ones who build more than the ones who break. And as the tram accelerated into the black tunnels that led to the horizon beyond the reach of the Sicari, beyond the sensors of the Tetrarchs, the boy and the mechanic stared ahead, not into darkness, but into possibility. Because what they carried now wasn't just knowledge. It was hope tempered by training, sharpened by legacy, and ready to be wielded. Chapter 3. Ghosts Don't Stay Dead. The tram burst out from the underlines of Virox, 7 like a forgotten bullet fired through time, its rust-coated frame vibrating as it rolled across bridges and collapsed pylons, past gutted military bunkers, and sunken silos half buried beneath the eternal red dunes. In the distance, lightning danced along the cracked ridge lines, not from any storm, but from the planetary defense grids rebooting themselves, alerts triggered by unauthorized tunnel activity and deep chamber reactivations. The Sicari Combat Guild, once indifferent to the barely tolerated human mechanic and his outcast student, had now sent data to every regional command node, flagging the Kale bloodline as an echo of something more dangerous than a weapon. It was the reawakening of forgotten purpose. And yet, inside that ancient tram, surrounded by dust and the rattling of half-century-old engineering, Riven didn't feel hunted. He felt ready. They didn't speak for some time as the tram raced toward the outer reaches of the sector. Only when they emerged into the dark throat of a canyon and the electromagnetic sensors dropped to near zero did Thale finally stir. He rose from his seat, moving with the slow deliberation of someone assembling thoughts too heavy to carry casually, and made his way to a hatch on the tram sidewall. With a grunt, he yanked it open to reveal a hard case container marked with Kale insignia burned in deep with laser branding, wrapped in steel chains that pulsed with biometric locks. Riven watched, wordless, as Thale placed his palm on the top panel, and a dozen gears shifted with mechanical groans that sounded almost alive. With a hiss of steam, the container opened, and inside lay a suit of armor unlike anything Riven had seen in the simulation archives or on parade grounds. It wasn't sleek or ceremonial, it was brutal, practical, and terrifying in its elegance. Black plating overlay reinforced joints, augmented with exothread musculature, and the forearm gauntlets glowed faintly with kinetic storage banks. The helmet wasn't shaped for intimidation, it was shaped to survive, with visors layered in 3 spectrums and ports along the neck that pulsed softly like a second heartbeat. This, Thale said, eyes locked on the armor, is the last of what your grandfather left behind that the Empire didn't find. They called it the Ghost Skin. Built for adaptability, engineered to interface with field environments and weapon systems without needing centralized networks. The kind of gear that thinks with you, not for you. Your grandfather designed this for his final student. He never got to give it to him. That student died in orbit during a sabotage strike 2 days before graduation. Daneth never built another. He closed the case again, locking it down. But I kept it, because deep down I knew one day, someone like you would come back. Not for glory, not for revenge, but to finish the damn lesson. Riven said nothing for a while. His mind churned like a forge, words catching in his throat, not because he was afraid but because the gravity of the moment felt sacred. Everything up until now had been theory, training, reaction, but now there was direction, purpose. He knelt beside the armor and rested his fingers against the cold plating, feeling the quiet hum within it, as though the very suit itself recognized something in him. How many people will want me dead because of this? He asked finally. Thale exhaled a short laugh. Too many to count, but none of them will see it coming. They disembarked from the tram near a collapsed communications relay, where old drones scavenged rusted circuits from what had once been part of the orbital uplink spine. Here, under the cover of a dead tower, Thale had built a bunker into the rock, a hybridized shelter of human engineering and repurposed Sicari tech, its entrance invisible to scanning drones and buried under 20 meters of thermal massed stone. Inside, the air smelled of metal, oil, and old ideas. There were workbenches lined with disassembled signal jammers, modular weapons, and prototype combat sensors. Dozens of blueprints lined the walls, some drawn by hand, others burned into metal sheets with fine plasma etching. It wasn't a hideout. It was a warforge. Riven walked among the relics in silence, fingers trailing over consoles, cables, and devices whose purpose he didn't yet understand. But every piece whispered to him. Every tool felt like it had waited for his hands. That night, as the storm front rolled in and winds howled like ghosts clawing at the mountain passes, Thale began teaching him the second layer of the legacy, the one that wasn't recorded in holograms or stored in simulations. The part of the Kale training that lived in stories and scars, passed from hand to hand in the flicker of dying flames and the glow of welding arcs. He showed Riven how to listen not just to words, but to systems, to frequency modulations in enemy comms, to the rhythm of a soldier's breath before they strike. He taught him to patch pressure lines under gunfire, to mask his own signals using enemy transmissions, to program a fusion detonator with 2 fingers while hiding in a radiation pocket. The training no longer asked him to fight. It asked him to survive, to rebuild, to manipulate his surroundings like an engineer and weaponize circumstance. And Riven absorbed it all, not like a child learning, but like a weapon remembering how to be dangerous. He stopped thinking of himself as a trainee. He stopped flinching at failure. His mind rewired itself to solve under stress, to adapt faster than protocols could follow, and to anticipate not just what the enemy would do but what they would never expect. He became fluent in silence, fluent in machine speech, fluent in the space between a command and its execution. He learned to create chaos from broken things and find order in the chaos that followed. One evening, as they sat over a shared canister of ration stew, Thale finally spoke the name of the real enemy. The Tetrarchs, he said, voice low, eyes unfocused. They weren't just bureaucrats. They were architects of the erasure. They didn't just dismantle the old empire, they replaced its memory. They rewrote what people believed about Earth's legacy, made it seem like your grandfather was a footnote, like humans were always bottom-rung support staff. But you've seen the truth. We weren't footnotes. We were the spine. Riven stared into the steaming bowl between his hands and nodded. So what now? Thale's eyes gleamed in the half-dark. Now we make them remember. Outside, the stars of Virox, 7 twinkled coldly in the sky, but deep in that hidden forge, a new fire was burning, silent, steady, and impossibly old. It was 2 weeks later, 17 days since Riven had been slapped in the arena and publicly humiliated, and 13 since the entire outer command grid had been alerted to the reactivation of what was supposed to be a forgotten Kale archive that the first hunter arrived. Not an army, not a fleet, no banners or threats, just a lone assassin, dropped under cover of a false storm that swept across the northern hemisphere of Virox. 7, masking the descent of a cloaked vessel so advanced its heat signature matched the stone around it. The assassin didn't knock. He didn't send warnings. He entered the outer relay bunker in silence, his boots leaving no prints, his suit modulating to mimic environmental textures, his presence marked only by the sudden, inexplicable failure of 3 perimeter drones and a long pause in the airflow through the southern vent tunnel. Riven didn't see him, but Thale did. Not with his eyes, but with the older senses trained in battlefields that never made it into public record. The old mechanic had been asleep with one hand on a coil gun beneath his bunk, and the moment the drones failed to return their ping echo, he was moving, boots on, visor down, spine rigid like a predator expecting to die in peace and now offended by the interruption. The assassin, known in Tetrarch files as Vorn Tau, had been active for over 100 standard years. Rumors said he was part symbiotic tech, part clone DNA from extinct warlords, and part something else, something the Tetrarchs didn't name aloud. His armor shimmered in soft pulses, adapting with each step. He was not built for show. He was built to kill legends and erase what they left behind. And yet, when he entered the core chamber, the room lit with warm gold from exposed fuel rods that Thale had intentionally rerouted, creating a lighting scenario that would cause every adaptive suit to struggle with recalibration. It was a mechanic's trap, not a soldier's, and that was the mistake Tal had made. He had come expecting a fight, not a system failure. The moment the flicker in his visor gave away his position for a fraction of a second, Thale hurled a magnetic rod across the chamber, the kind used to restabilize fusion engines, and the assassin's silhouette flared into visibility with a scream of static. Riven had been in the back module, practicing silent reassembly of an old surveillance jammer, when the alert klaxon triggered in his bracer, not the default tone, but the one labeled Red Fall. The code his grandfather had used to mean one thing: kill or be killed. He moved without thinking, grabbing only what he needed: his reinforced gloves, his bladed wrist rig, and the bracer, now integrated with the ghost skin's partial interface. He didn't even hesitate as he passed the arming rack and activated the kinetic charge in his boots, leaping over the workbench toward the chamber where Thale had already engaged the assassin. What Riven found was chaos: flashing lights, steam hissing from broken pipes, shadows moving like water across the walls, and the sound of two lives dancing dangerously close to death. Thale fought not with elegance, but efficiency. Every movement meant something. Every strike planned 2 motions ahead, as if he'd already seen the flowchart of this encounter 100 times in his head. But Tal was relentless, his blade like liquid fire, cutting through reinforced plating with precision that didn't belong to someone merely trained. It was the kind of motion only bred for erasure. Riven didn't think. He calculated. He saw the space between Thale's steps, the edge of Tal's arc, the delay in his spin where his left flank was exposed for exactly 0.3 seconds. That was all Riven needed. He moved low, activated the bracer's pulse spike, and slid across the floor in a burst of kinetic momentum that lifted dust and sparks behind him like a comet tail. He struck where instinct told him to, the spike hitting Tal's exposed plating with a hiss, burning through the outer weave and forcing the assassin to disengage just long enough for Thale to unload 3 focused shots into his abdomen. The assassin didn't scream. He simply collapsed, his systems powering down in stages like a dying machine god. For a long moment, no one moved. Thale dropped to one knee, panting, his weapon trembling in his hand, while Riven stood frozen, unsure if what they had just done was victory or invitation for worse. Then Tal's body shimmered and began to disintegrate, not melting, not exploding, but being deconstructed from the inside, his armor and flesh folding into dust with eerie silence. The Tetrarchs had sent something not just to kill, but to disappear. A message. Thale looked at the scorched floor, then at Riven. "That was your final test," he said flatly. "They know you're real now. There won't be one next time. There'll be dozens." Riven swallowed. His heart hadn't stopped pounding. "So what do we do?" "We prepare," Thale growled. "We go dark. We go mobile. And we gather what's left." He pulled up a hidden holomap from the corner console, one Riven hadn't seen before, an ancient empire chart marked with forgotten way stations, cryptic sigils, and notes written in a hybrid code of mechanic shorthand and military coordinates. Your grandfather didn't just train fighters. He left seeds. Quiet ones. Recruits scattered in remote systems. Exiles. Engineers. Thinkers. Soldiers who believed in his way. We're going to wake them up. Every last one. The chamber seemed to hum louder, as if the ghost of Daneth Kale himself had stirred in approval. Riven stepped forward and touched the map. His fingers hovered over one blinking coordinate, a name long forgotten even by military historians. "What's this one?" he asked. Thale smiled grimly. That's where the last sentinel sleeps. The one who swore to protect Kale's heir, should he ever rise again." Riven looked up, eyes burning with resolve. "Then let's wake him." Outside, lightning raked the desert sky, and the wind carried the cry of broken machines. But deep beneath the sand, the Kale legacy had already begun to march. Chapter 4, The Sentinel and the Spark. They departed the Virox, 7 bunker under a blood-red dawn, when the planet's twin suns barely crested the horizon and cast jagged shadows like scars across the rust-colored dunes. Riven wore the ghost skin now not in ceremony, but in necessity. It had bonded with him during the night after Thale, and he ran final diagnostics, the armor syncing to his heartbeat and biometrics as if it had always known his pulse. The moment it clamped across his chest and sealed around his spine, the boy felt himself become part of something far older and heavier than he could yet fully understand. Every step forward was no longer just his. It was the echo of generations walking beside him, their stories written not in ink but in carbon scoring, data shards, and half-buried codes long exiled from history. Their destination was a dead moon on the edge of the Darien expanse, a lifeless rock abandoned during the collapse of the Outer Rim Defense Fleet. The map called it Haldren's Wake, but Thale insisted the name didn't matter. "It's what's buried underneath that the galaxy's forgotten," he'd said, and Riven hadn't asked further questions. He was learning that in this war, some truths arrived too large for words. The journey was made in silence, across two systems using an old courier frigate powered by scavenged warp arrays that Thale had personally patched together. It was not a ship of elegance or comfort. It groaned through hyperspace like a beast forced awake too soon, every jump a risk of unraveling. Yet it carried them forward, a cocoon of resistance wrapped in forgotten engineering. Riven spent the transit hours poring through what little remained of the Kale logs, not just learning, but absorbing ancient tactics layered with philosophical reasoning, designs for combat droids that taught ethics alongside formation tactics, schematics of weapons with safeties so deeply encoded they refused to fire on anything unarmed. The more he studied, the more he realized, this legacy wasn't just about fighting. It was about preservation of purpose, of identity, of choice in a galaxy that had forgotten all three. Haldren's wake came into view like a bruise against the stars. No atmosphere, no surface movement, no signs of power. But as they approached the dark side of the moon, a series of hexagonal canyons revealed themselves, etched not by nature, but by the passage of massive structures now buried beneath the crust. Thale guided the frigate to a precise landing spot marked only by an electromagnetic echo that pulsed every 13 seconds, a signal so faint that most scanners dismissed it as planetary background noise. But Thale had recognized it instantly. It was the pulse of a dormant Sentinel beacon, a Kale-designed failsafe, buried generations ago and coded to awaken only when the genetic signature of a Kale heir drew near. They descended into the fissure on foot, the ghost skin adjusting Riven's internal pressure with each level drop. The walls were smooth and metallic beneath the dust, and the deeper they went, the more the air changed not in composition, but in memory. Riven could feel it, a weight that pressed against his skin like the gaze of something ancient watching through the walls. At last, they reached the base, a circular chamber the size of a destroyer hangar, with a central monolith rising from the ground. Thale activated a signal rod and drove it into the floor. The reaction was immediate. The monolith pulsed blue, then white, then opened, flowering like an ancient mechanical lotus, revealing a single figure within, encased in a pod of cryoamber. The Sentinel. She was not what Riven expected. Tall, nearly 7 feet, her form was encased in armor that looked almost ceremonial, but bore the scars of real battle. Her hair, trapped in suspension, floated like black silk, and her features were sharply defined, almost carved yet not inhuman. Her face bore the unmistakable look of someone who had once laughed freely, suffered deeply, and chosen silence over compromise. Her eyes opened slowly, and when they locked onto Riven, they did not show confusion. They showed recognition. "I've waited long enough," she said, her voice hoarse but firm, resonating from deep within her chest. "Who claims the right to wake me?" Thale stepped aside. "He does." Riven stepped forward, unsure whether to speak his name or his blood. In the end, he gave both. "Riven Kale, grandson of Daneth. And I've come to finish what he started." The Sentinel studied him, and for a moment, the silence between them was electric, ancient machinery humming softly in the background like a choir of old gods listening to the verdict. Then she stepped forward, the pod dissolving into dust around her, and dropped to one knee. "Then I am yours," she said, "as I was his." Thale exhaled, long and slow, the moment settling around them like stone. "You're not alone anymore," he murmured. "The galaxy will remember." What followed was swift and deliberate. The Sentinel activated the chamber's controls and brought power flooding through the facility. Dormant lights flared back to life, revealing walls lined with armories, data cores, and tactical gear far beyond anything modern militaries used. It was a vault not just of weapons but of ideas. Blueprints, memory banks, fabrication units, all coded to the Kale family's philosophy. Build smart, fight less, survive more, never forget. For hours, the three of them worked in concert, reactivating systems, syncing maps, pinging old satellites that still lurked in low orbit waiting for forgotten orders. And then came the signal. A burst from the relay hidden deep within the moon's crust. A beacon, now pulsing openly across secure bands in the old Imperial frequency. Its message was simple. Just 2 words. "Kale lives." Across the galaxy, hidden eyes saw it. In the mining colonies of Shader Prime, where the oppressed still whispered tales of old Earth resistance, an old mechanic stared at the stars and wept. On the edge of the Vathak Nebula, where smugglers bartered food for ammo, a cloaked woman activated a ship that hadn't flown in a decade and began plotting a course. And within the sealed war council of the Tetrarch Alliance, alarms blared, because they all understood what it meant. The Kale legacy had returned, and with it the one thing they feared more than rebellion: hope. The moon's vault bloomed into purpose with each passing hour, its once dormant corridors now alive with the rhythm of resurrection. Thale worked in silent efficiency, restoring old terminals, calibrating communication nodes, and laying down diagnostic subroutines with the ease of a man who had once built and buried legacies across star systems. Riven watched and mirrored him, his every movement slowly replacing the reflexes of an apprentice with the instincts of something more. With the sentinel whose name, they discovered, was Vera by their side, their small trio became a current, awakening lost systems across the chamber, drawing power from deep geothermal channels hidden within Haldren's Wake's fractured crust. Each bootstep across the steel floors sounded heavier than the last, not from physical strain, but from the growing realization that they weren't just lighting up an old base, they were lighting up an idea. A legacy long buried beneath propaganda, denial, and time. The ghosts of the Kale Doctrine were not ghosts at all. They had merely been waiting for a voice loud enough, and a heart stubborn enough, to call them back. When the first allies began to respond to the reactivation beacon, it started as a trickle, a fragmented message bouncing through fractured relay chains, most garbled by decay or intercepted by Tetrarch scramblers, but some slipped through, threading themselves across forgotten stars like secret threads tying together the loose bones of a dream. The first was a war priestess from the ice moons of Valen, her voice ragged but sharp as she recited the old oaths of unity. Then came the signal burst from the technosage of Relker's belt, encrypted in 6 languages, but unmistakable in intent. Old friends, old students, old believers. None of them asked for proof. The words alone Kale lives were enough to rattle sleeping memories and stoke fires long starved of air. Across the scattered outskirts of civilized space, messages whispered through back doors and merchant hubs and deep-rooted veins of digital shadow markets. Black market AI brokers began recording a spike in pre-empire phrases. Armed smugglers began asking where the Kale tech was headed. And on Virox 7, where this story had begun with a slap and a boast, Sixilla stood in the arena once more, staring at the scorch marks Riven had left behind, her hands clasped behind her back, whispering under her breath. So, it was true after all. But the Tetrarchs were not slow to react. A week after the Sentinel was awakened, the skies above Haldren's Wake split with black thunder, and orbit began to fracture under the weight of a dread fleet. 5 cruisers, 14 drop fangs, and a full brigade of synthetic infantry drones, all painted in the cobalt and silver livery of the 17-Hand Accord, the Tetrarch's deadliest enforcement wing. The message was unspoken but crystal clear. This was not a warning. It was a purge, a final act of erasure, this time meant to burn not just data but blood, stone, and memory. They didn't broadcast demands. They didn't negotiate. They began planetary bombardment within minutes of arrival, energy spears slicing through canyons, cratering the upper ridges of the moon, and sealing escape tunnels with molten debris. Phil didn't panic. He simply walked to the command console, pressed his hand into the core command glyph, and began uploading the complete Kale archive to every node, ship, and safehouse still tethered to the old network's one final data cascade. "They can kill us," he said to Riven, his voice flat as he typed lines of archaic code faster than any AI would dare attempt to translate. "But they can't kill the idea now. Not with this out there." Riven stood beside him, helmet sealed, armor humming with energy. "We can't hold this place," he said. "They'll glass it." Vera stepped forward, her voice quiet but certain. "Then we hold them long enough for the world to wake up." And so they did. The last stand of Haldren's Wake was not marked by grand battles or heroic charges. It was marked by precision, by sabotage, by old Kale tricks deployed with perfect timing. They didn't try to win. They tried to teach. Every Tetrarch unit that dropped was met with traps, logic bombs, power reroutes that turned their own weapons against them. Cloaked turrets embedded in walls calibrated to target based on code of conduct rather than appearance, drones reprogrammed in midair, and terrain hacked by Riven himself to collapse under troop movements mapped by the archive's predictive models. Thale moved like a conductor guiding symphonies of broken machinery into one final performance, and Vera became a living shadow, her movements slicing through invaders like a forgotten poem spoken in steel and fire. But it wasn't enough. Not for victory. Not when the dreadnoughts opened their main cannons and fired into the heart of the mountain. The chamber collapsed. The signal fell silent. And across the stars, the Tetrarchs declared victory. Yet it was a victory that tasted like ash. Because by then, the archive had reached thousands. By then, whispers had turned to rallies. And by then, Kale wasn't a name. It was a movement. Months passed. In quiet places where no Tetrarch I could see, humans and aliens alike began training in old Kale methods. Former mechanics taught children to think like engineers. Ex-soldiers found use in teaching tactics that avoided war rather than inciting it. The phrase "fix what they break" became a creed. And in the orbit of a blue-green world tucked in the spinward arm of the galaxy, a stolen cruiser painted with the mark of the broken circle hovered in stealth, broadcasting one message on a loop across every outlaw frequency. Air confirmed. Kale lives. The fire has returned. And somewhere maybe in the rubble of Haldren's wake, or maybe on another moon entirely, a boy in black armor stood alone against a broken skyline, staring out into a storm-lit sky, not as a warrior, not as a legend, but as a mechanic with fire in his bones, legacy in his hands, and a galaxy finally ready to remember what it had lost. The Kale name wasn't dead. It was just getting started.